Okay, just going to make sure I'm admitting this. There's a few people that are just still coming in. We're recording this meeting because it is an international conference with a number of people all over the world. So what we'll do is this will be uploaded to the event schedule later so that everyone can continue the discussion on the discussion board if they like. And Bahira, I can pass those questions along to you afterwards if you'd like to.
That sounds fine.
Anything there. I'm just going to admit these last few people. Okay, well, we should be ready. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome our first plenary speaker, Bahira Trusk, who is a professor and chair of human development and family sciences at the University of Delaware. Dr. Trusk's research focuses on globalization, women's employment, and family change in Western and non-Western countries. And she presents regularly on these topics at international forums. Today, she's presenting the paper titled, "Do Families Matter for Sustainable Development?" I'm really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Trask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gilbert, and thank you, Ms. Costa. She's been wonderful about communicating with me and making sure I have all the appropriate links and everything. Welcome everybody else who is listening in. And I am delighted to be here. I am going to be sharing my screen, so give me 1 minute, please. So I am going to be, since this is a conference, my understanding is it's focused on sustainability and education. I'm actually going to be talking about families and specifically youth and adolescents and how they contribute to sustainability if we support them properly. So I want to start out and introduce the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This was adopted by every country that belongs to the United Nations in 2015. And it is a highly unusual pact in human history because every country is expected to meet the goals of what they call the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Holistically speaking, they focus on ending poverty worldwide, promoting shared economic prosperity, protecting the environment, and social development and people's well-being. I have condensed these 17 goals, and I think there are 186 targets into these 4 major umbrella buckets. Oops. So these SDGs build on the basic philosophical foundation of the United Nations that every individual around the world has a right to basic necessities, including social rights. And this is something that I am personally very interested in my research, because I feel that in many situations we have broken that social contract. Yeah, we are allowing, and I'll be talking a lot more about this, we're allowing some people to live extremely well and many, many, many other people to live in extreme poverty. And I really feel like we need to rethink the way we are basically running the world. And the SDGs very much focus on exactly this issue. So we spend a lot of time talking about political rights, but also I think we need to be looking at social rights. Social rights are basic to creating peaceful societies and societies that are inclusive of everybody. And when I talk about social rights, we're really talking about access to good health and well-being, gender equality, inclusion in general, justice, and sort of recognizing each individual's worth and promoting their capabilities also. Each of us has a talent, but it's different for each of us. And when one does that, one end equation is a peaceful society. In 2018, the then United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said in a talk, the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals depends on how well families are empowered to contribute to the achievement of those goals. Thus, policies focusing on the well-being of families are certain to benefit development. This is a very important quote because it is one of the only times in all of this work where families are singled out and emphasized as foundational to the social rights I was talking about. Unfortunately, in this UN 2030 agenda, there is no concrete focus on supporting and strengthening families. So none of the SDGs actually focus specifically on families. And even in the targets, like I said, there are many, many targets. The families, I think, are only mentioned 3 times. And one time is like around rural families, and one time is around gender equality. So we don't, even though we recognize the importance, there are no sort of specific tangible foci on families. And yet, families still matter. So I have sort of devoted my career to this topic, basically, because I feel that in academic research, in the social sciences, we spend a lot of time discussing individual development, individual rights, all of that. We also focus quite a bit on communities and on societies, but families have fallen by the wayside, especially as a focus of academic study and also in many places policy development. So, but families around the world in Western and non-Western places still give individuals their first sense of personal and social identity. There have been all kinds of experiments throughout history to try to raise children in other types of settings, and none of them have persevered. In the end, we are still dependent initially on what we're introduced to in our families. Families provide sort of a psychological, social well-being, but fundamentally, they are also a basic economic unit. And again, especially for an initial start, and we're going to talk more about that with respect to children, that's where you get your initial set of resources from. They provide shelter, food, clothing, etc. Like I said, despite all kinds of experiments throughout history, families are the most efficient unit for rearing and nurturing children. I have done research in a variety of low-income settings, sometimes with families that, all kinds of families where there have been a lot of different issues that the families have had to deal with. And I've given a lot of personal thought to the fact that when children don't have a stable environment, and just for the record, I don't mean mom and dad and a dog and a white picket fence. I just mean a caretaker who provides for them in the most basic way. Society then has to pick up the issues, and it becomes very complicated and very expensive. So families are still the best way we have for raising and nurturing children. Also, families do more than raise children. Families in many different ways provide care for vulnerable individuals, people who are ill, people who have significant disabilities, frail elderly at times. So families have a lot of functions that they still perform today in Western and non-Western settings. However, when families are put under very stressful conditions, for example, they live in extreme poverty, they don't have access to good health care, they don't have access to childcare, or they are exposed to violence and political violence, they're unable to perform their functions in a successful manner. Like I just said, I have seen that in my own work in working in low-income communities. Also, a lot of studies indicate that if children grow up in extreme poverty, this can have long-range effects on child and youth development. Everything from long-term health issues to not learning appropriate language skills, to not being exposed to certain types of opportunities. So it's not an equal playing field out there. On top of this, we are witnessing all kinds of global societal transformations. So as I just said, not everybody lives in this quote unquote ideal two-parent family. We have around the world seen changes in structures of families, including an increase in single parenting. It can be through divorce, it can be through separation. We've seen an increase in cohabitation and also childbearing while people are cohabiting. Another major demographic change around the world, except for in sub-Saharan Africa, is we've seen the growth of the elderly population. We are moving in our lifetime into a situation where there will be more elderly people than there are young people in societies. We're already seeing that in a lot of European societies. So instead of it looking like a pyramid where you have a lot of children at the bottom and then some people on top, now it's looking more and more like a rectangle. This raises all kinds of issues, including around who's going to perform labor in the society, who's going to consume all the stuff that we produce. And it has exacerbated the care issues across the spectrum in both high and low income countries. I just read yesterday that China now has opened up childbearing for couples. They can have up to 3 children because of the issues around care. There's a worry that there are going to be so many elderly people and who's going to provide all of this care. This is all these demographic changes are juxtaposed with globalization. And what globalization has done is it has actually limited, it has decreased families' abilities to control their own economic and social well-being. So people used to have a little bit more independence about what it is that they did, and this is becoming less and less. This is all coupled with very complex discourses around the world in terms of what is the role of government in people's lives, what is the role of the market in people's lives, who does what, where, what are the programs and policies that we need to help individuals and families be successful. And these discourses are very different in different parts of the world, as well as within societies. So where you are located in your own society matters. One of the most major issues facing our world is increasing inequality. Inequality within societies and inequality between societies. And inequality is very much tied to social rights, because the more unequal that people are within a community or a society, it causes social unrest. In a minute, we're going to talk a little bit about globalization, but something that's been happening through increasing communication technologies is there's a change in the perception of poverty. So even though we actually have fewer very poor people in the world, that number has actually improved. So it's called absolute poverty. What we've seen is an increase in relative poverty. So for example, if you used to be an individual living in a village, faraway village in India, that's all you knew. You knew your village and you compared yourself to the peers in your village. Now, through the internet, through movies, TV, all of this, now people are aware that there are people who live very, very differently, even within their own society. And thus, they actually feel poorer. So they may be just as poor as their parents and their grandparents, but they feel poorer because of these different perceptions that have been introduced into their lives. And when there's such great inequality, what it does is it tears at the social fabric of a society, because people tend to not trust each other because they think that others are trying to exploit them. I want to give you just one example. People usually look at economics in terms of inequality, but we have a lot of different types of inequality. And I happened just the other day to see this map, and I thought it would be just perfect for my talk today and to make the point I'm making. Think about what has been happening during the pandemic. Those of us who live in the Western world in a high income setting, we've been sitting at home with the internet. Yeah, and all of my friends complain about how terrible the pandemic has been. They really miss, their friends and going out to restaurants and being able to travel. But we've had the internet. Now, if you look at this map, what you see is internet use. So you see, I'm located in the United States. Nice dark green color. Most of us have access to internet. We have access to communication. But look at the rest of the world. Look at the continent, for example, of Africa, with the exception of South Africa and Nigeria and Kenya, and a little bit in Tunisia. Most people in Africa do not have regular access to the internet. Now, it's going to vary within societies, again, depending on people's social location, but it's just sort of to make a point. And then if you look, if you go over to Asia, you see the same sort of thing. So when we're talking about inequality, it's not just financial inequality. We now have a huge digital divide across the world. And this impacts people's abilities to know things, to have access opportunities, to become aware of what is happening. So that is just one example of inequality across the world. So globalization, as Dr. Gilbert mentioned, I've worked a lot on this area of globalization. I'm very, very preoccupied with it because what has happened is that when we talk about globalization, we always think of it as an economic process. And we think about the political implications of globalization. But what we haven't really done is discuss the effects of globalization on families, and also how families affect globalization. So what has happened over the last 20 to 30 years is that instead of governments making decisions, taking responsibility, setting up programs, increasingly it is the market that is doing that. Yeah, it's the market that determines job opportunities, the flows of jobs to different places, the flow of money, that sort of thing. That has been coupled with a shrinking of state support for families. So, for example, retirement benefits, health benefits, quality national childcare. Some places have it, some places don't, but there's been a shrinking of these kinds of programs, social programs that support families. A lot of that is the result of globalization. And yet, despite all of this, family, as I've been arguing, has remained important for individuals, including in the West. We tend to have a dialogue in the West that we're all very individual and that, our opportunities are based on our individual chances, our individual capabilities. But in reality, we have very specific social locations, and they are within our families. So, and that gives us a certain amount of resources or lack of resources also. So globalization needs to be reconceptualized, which it has been by some scholars, not all, by some, as not just economic and political forces, but that it is a new form of bridging geographic and cultural distances. So it affects us in many ways that we don't really understand yet. And it affects us differently depending on social class, location, gender, ethnicity, race, all of the other characteristics that mark us as well. So we're all going to experience globalization in very different ways. For example, for high-income people, it may mean increased opportunities. You can go from one society to another society, get a great job in a corporation, make a lot of money. But it can affect a woman working in Bangladesh in a clothing factory very, very differently because globalization is tied to the flow of money. And so if a company is producing clothes in Bangladesh and they figure out that it's actually cheaper now to produce the same kind of clothing in the Philippines, they're going to close that plant in Bangladesh. They're going to open a new one in the Philippines. And the women who are working in the plant in Bangladesh, which is, by the way, often under horrific conditions, but that's a whole nother issue, they all lose their jobs. And then what happens? So globalization is a very complex phenomenon that is not just a series of numbers across a screen. Is it good? Is it bad? There are a lot of arguments around it. It's ambiguous. Like I just said, it affects different people very, very differently. There are some individuals that have greatly benefited from globalization, and others have lost more and more control over their own lives and have fewer and fewer choices. So it's affecting how we should educate our young people, because increasingly, we are more and more tied to others. We interact more and more with other people who think very differently than we do. And it can be, again, at all different levels. So some people work for international companies. It is not unusual these days to have teams of people who have very, very different backgrounds. You may live in one society and you may be managing a team in another society. We've really seen that exacerbated through COVID and sort of this virtual revolution we're in. But you're also competing with individuals from other places who have potentially very high levels of skills, education, whatever it is that is needed for specific jobs. So, work competition is not just local anymore. Also, it can work in a positive way, that there are new communities that form around certain issues. For example, we've seen that with climate change, where people come together from different parts of the world and they start initiatives in new ways that one could not even imagine 10, 15 years ago. Everybody forgets these days. Social media is really new. 15 years ago, nobody even knew what social media was. But just as an anecdote, my daughter just yesterday asked me, "Mom, what did you do before Google? How did you find any information?" And I had to explain to her how complicated it was, and how in my lifetime, we've seen an enormous change from the difficulty of getting information to being just absolutely, showered with so much information, we don't know what to do with it. So, one of the major phenomena that is happening in our world, we've never had as many adolescents alive in the world before. So we have currently about 1.2 billion young people who are considered youth. That is about 16% of the global population. And that translates into 1 in 6 people is an adolescent. 89%, or 9 out of 10, live in low-income countries. That is a very important fact, because I showed you the internet map before. So most of these young people do not have access to some of the things that I have been talking about. And again, just to give you sort of a little bit of a perspective, India currently has around 560 million young people. The United States as a whole has 331 million people. So India has almost double as many young people as we have a whole population. That presents challenges and it presents opportunities. So when we have discussions about education and youth employment, skills, that sort of thing, the focus on adolescents is critical. I say that because I find that there is a huge emphasis these days on early childhood. And I am completely on board with the focus on young children. But I think we forget how important it is to continue the discussion, the scholarship, the research, and the opportunity building for young people. Yeah, we shouldn't just pour all of our resources and our focus into one end of the life course. I think it really needs to be, we need a much broader span than that. And again, it's different in different parts of the world. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, half of the population is under 18. In Europe, it's very, very different. In Europe, many countries are having trouble getting their fertility over 1 child per couple or per woman. So again, just this map shows you a little bit the distribution of young people around the world, and you can, so you get a little bit of a feeling of the regional differences. Global poverty is specifically very harmful to young people. And it affects young people in many different ways, but in particular has to do with employment. So there's less and less opportunities when we look at it globally for young people, because kids that are not in school are often engaged in irregular or what's called vulnerable employment. Vulnerable employment means that if someone's going to get fired, you're going to be the first one. So, if a company or a business needs to lay someone off, they lay the people at the bottom off first, the ones who haven't been there a long time, that sort of thing. And that's been particularly true for young people. It's highest in the Middle East and North Africa. And then it's different in different parts of the world. And COVID has only worsened that whole situation. And here, again, just a graph to show you that, it got a little bit better around 2007. And ever since then, there's been an increase in global youth employment. When young people don't have opportunities to study and or work, it affects every aspect of their lives. So it affects the access to education, to training, to being incorporated into the paid labor force, and also to find some meaning in life and to be integrated into the social fabric of their society. Currently, about 120 million young people reach working age every year. And most of those young people don't have many, if any, opportunities because, like I said, they're living in the poorer parts of the world. It also this affects family life, because if young people do not have access to employment, they can't couple up in permanent relationships, and they are much more reluctant to have children. So economics, opportunities, and family formation are very closely tied to each other. Also, it creates a very vague life course trajectory. So people don't know how to plan. If you don't know how you're going to pay for yourself or yourself and another dependent over the next couple of years, it is very difficult to plan anything for the next 5 or 10 years. So it makes young people very reluctant to enter into more permanent relationships. All of this is coupled with social media that kind of fuels certain perceptions. And as I said previously, this issue of inequality. So, I may be living somewhere where I don't have access to education, I don't have access to jobs, and I see that if I was a well-to-do young person in New York City, I would have a very different life. And so this creates a lot of stress also and conflict, and can lead to incredible social unrest. That's my personal worry, is that if we let the situation continue in the way that it is, we're going to see some really disastrous outcomes that are going to come. Also, I cannot finish talking about this without mentioning gender issues. And when I talk about gender, I specifically am talking about gender issues that affect poor girls and women. I'm just going to, I've talked about this, so I want to get to the gender piece so that I don't spend, I'm sorry, I see that I'm taking too much time on this. So gender inequality persists all around the world, despite the fact that every government pretty much around the world has taken up gender issues as an important goal within their society. So some countries have been, have done better in terms of gender equality than others, and yet gender inequality exists pretty much throughout the world. This raises the question, why? If governments have taken this up as a goal, they've put a lot of money into it, they've enacted policies around gender empowerment, gender inequality, what is going on here? Well, the most frequent problem has to do with the low status of girls and women in a lot of places. So girls and women are still perceived differently in terms of their abilities, their capabilities in many parts of the world. They are limited in their civic engagement. They're not empowered to engage in initiatives that will allow them to better their own and the situation for their peers. sometimes, not all times, sometimes this is also tied to local customs, beliefs, and practices. This is a big topic, so we can talk more about it in the discussion. I did want to show you quickly this graph because it shows the way governments around the world, they have tried to empower women in terms of keeping, providing more access to schooling, all of that sort of thing. And the orange is the success rate of countries around the world. So despite putting a lot of money and a lot of effort in, as you can see, we haven't been particularly successful. So again, this is a complicated topic, but why has gender equality not been realized? It really has to be understood that this concept of gender equality is understood very differently in different places. It means different things in different places. And in many cultural contexts, boys are still privileged over girls. They're given better food, they are given better health care, and a lot of times, as you'll see in one of my next slides, they're the ones who get to go to school, and once girls hit puberty, they don't go to school anymore. Even if they have a mom who works outside of the home, a lot of girls in different places in the world, they're forced to stay home and take care of all the domestic responsibilities. So there's a very interesting organization called Plan UK, and they specifically study and promote programs for young women around the world in low-income contexts. And they put together this graphic here that, in certain places in the world, girls still have no say about who it is they marry, and even they feel they can't speak up at all when they are in the presence of boys. All of this has health consequences. So in high income countries, like where I live here in the United States, women live approximately to the age of 82. And if you are a woman who is upper middle class, upper class, your life expectation is even higher than that. In low-income countries, with the average life expectancy is only around 63 years. So there are consequences from this lack of gender empowerment and gender equality. All of these gender issues are really tied to education. As I just said, a lot of times young women don't have access to school. Especially in sub-Saharan Africa, many young women still have to marry quite young. They have babies quite young. When I say quite young, I mean under the age of 18, and this really limits their future opportunities. There is a gendered division of household labor. Girls are socialized into very strict gender roles. And I do want to point out that gender disparities are the widest usually among poor families. So you can have within the same society very different experiences. It's not all one and the same. So again, just a graph to show you a little bit. So in North America, for example, most young women go to high school. This is not true in other parts of the world. I've talked about some of this, but I just also want to put, so I wanted to lay out all the different family issues, all the different social issues, and then how this affects young people, and then what can be done about this. So why should we care about these statistics and these social phenomena if we are researchers, practitioners, or policymakers? Well, the first thing I also want to point out is that a lot of the issues I've been talking about, they're thought of as private issues. Yeah, what goes on in people's families, who provides care, the kind of education people get. But they're not private issues, they're public issues because they contribute to the public good. And children and families are not self-reliant. They have never been self-reliant. There has always been some kind of community. That's how we've evolved as a human race, some kind of community that helps the whole. One of the things we've done, particularly in scholarship, and this has translated into programs and policies, is we focus specifically, like I said, on young children, or we focus specifically on the elderly, but very separate, not as individuals tied into communities, into family groups. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to invest in human capital, and we need to strengthen the human capabilities of both girls and boys. And specifically, we need policies that strengthen families and support the well-being and empowerment of young people. The world is not homogenizing in the way that media sometimes tells us, that we're all living the same lives, we're all doing the same things, and that, for example, girls and women are now empowered. What I've been trying to say is it's true in some places, it is not true in other places. And when it comes to families, we tend to often ignore the role of families because it's a complicated topic where families in the West are often seen as being oppressive in some form to women, to children, to young people. That's not how families are perceived in a lot of parts of the world. So around the world, families are still the place where, like I've said, children and young people access their first opportunities, and families can also be a shield from external oppression. So what can we do to help families and young people? Well, we need what is called social protection. Unicef has defined child-conditioned social protection as a basic human right. What this means is that states, that governments need to provide, they need to get more involved again, and they need to provide economic and social support to the most vulnerable segments of their populations. This can include, for example, and there's all kinds of examples out there about this, cash transfers, tax transfers, economic supports directed not just at a certain member of the family, but directed at the family unit. And we need family and community supports. For example, in some places, they're experimenting with making schools family centers. So at the school, you can access healthcare, elder care, child care, different, and in different parts of the world, they're doing different things around this, but they're sort of creating hubs where people, young people can learn computer skills, all of this sort of thing. Also, what we need to do is we need to really rethink education as a whole and promote gender parity in education around the world in more culturally appropriate ways, not always just sort of, the Western middle class version of what gender equality looks like. The issue of child marriage is, like I said, still very prevalent in certain parts of the world, and we need to find ways to, kind of move the age of marriage for girls up a little bit and prevent, young adolescent pregnancies, which, by the way, when a girl has her first baby at 13 or 14, that often has long-term health consequences. We need to improve employment and earnings opportunities, as well as encouraging sort of the participation in civil society and in decision-making in communities and in economic development. So what we need is we need a focus on education, a focus on participation, on protection, on health, and on employment. There is no one cookie cutter solution for what needs to happen. In different places, we really need very different types of approaches. And so I always advocate for having a menu of policy options, that people can choose from that works for their particular situation. In high-income countries, the focus is increasingly on what are called means-tested programs. So means-tested program is, for example, if you earn under a certain amount of money, you become eligible, for, certain food vouchers or housing vouchers, that sort of thing. What has been found to work in low-income countries is specifically cash transfers to encourage child schooling. So, if the parents are trying to decide who is going to go to school, and because they see their children as their economic asset for when they get old, A better approach is just to give money that they send all of their children to school, that kind of thing. Credit for labor, so that families can replace child labor. I was talking about girls having to do all the domestic chores with hired labor. These are just some examples. There's many other programs out there in terms of what can happen. I am a big advocate that states need to get more involved again in terms of providing services to individual families and communities. The market is not going to do that. The market is always going for the most low-cost solution possible. So, we need more regulation in that sort of way. Also, we need collaborations between governments and transnational organizations and local NGOs. We have a lot of on the ground, for example, in a lot of low income settings, we have a lot of sort of on the ground activity. What's been really interesting to me in talking to people who work in these NGOs is you have a lot of competition between these NGOs. There's no coordinated effort. And so that, that's going to be sort of the next phase thing that needs to happen. Also, we have transnational organizations that force governments to set certain types of policies. And what is often ignored is that we vote, in democratic societies, we vote for who represent us in governments. We don't vote for who represents us in these sort of transnational organizations. So they actually have a huge amount of power, like the World Bank, for example. Yeah, but we actually are not involved with them. They're not democratically elected officials. So, and we need, a focus on communication, on forums, on using the kinds of media that we now have available to bring together these various stakeholders to create practices and programs that are appropriate for specific local and regional settings. Like I said, one size doesn't fit all. It's going to be very, very different, even within the same society. I want to end just with the thought that we really need a family-focused path forward in order to achieve the goal of health, well-being, and sustainability for all from a global perspective. Thank you.